Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're really glad to see you here this evening at this session of the American Ethical Union Assembly. My name is Carolyn Parker. I'm officially the Master of Ceremonies this evening, although this is about all you'll hear from me as I get to that high point of my evening when I get to introduce our speaker. Until then, let me point out that our our host and our co-host this evening, who are giving technical support, showing the slides and making sure that the sound stays on or off, as you will soon all be muting yourselves, is our Emily Newman and Anna Orcutt Jans. They'll be available to you throughout the meeting via chat if you have any technical issues or questions that you need to ask them. And they will be helping us manage quite a few exciting things going on this evening. This session is Racism and Anti-Racism, Two American Traditions. It's part of our theme for the Assembly this year, addressing the whole truth about America, or as we've been told, addressing the whole truth about the United States. This session will be led by our speaker tonight, Jone Johnson Lewis. As you can see on the slide, she's been an ethical culture leader for 30 years, and she's currently the clergy leader for Riverdale-Yonkers Society. She's president of the National Ethical Service. She's the NES representative to the American Ethical Union Ethical Action Committee and quite a number of other committees, as you can see on the slide. I first met Joan at the Lay Leadership Summer School in 2016 and was awed by the knowledge that she brought to the group. I had a chance afterwards to actually Google her and begin to see some of her writings on the internet. She's well documented on the internet of women's history and the history of racism and anti-racism in our country. If you want to find some of her writings, you can go to thoughtco.com and see a number of the essays and series that she's prepared there on these very subjects. She's also been a strong voice in the American Ethical Union, reminding us of the ethics that we all hold and share regarding how we treat each other, bring out the best. I found her to be an inspiring leader and a good friend. So I'm going to ask Joan now to take it away. You're muted.
Mute. There we go. I'm really glad you're all here today for this presentation. It's an expansion and adaptation of a talk that I gave a couple of years ago for one of our local ethical societies. Start out by saying that studies show that most Americans cannot name more than 2 women scientists. So I wonder how true that is of another field. So let's try something. How many American anti-racist activists can you name? You'll soon find yourself in a breakout room of 3 to 4 people. If you find yourself alone, just hang in there. Others will join you soon. And then in your small group, in about 5 minutes, try to brainstorm together as many of the anti-racist activists of American history as you can. And when you get back, I'll explain how we'll share the names. We've got Frederick Douglass, John Lewis, Ibram Kendi, Hubert Harrison, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Polly Murphy, Heather McGee, Sojourner Truth, Bell Hooks, Rachel Cargill, Reverend Barber, Brittany Packnett Cunningham, Charles Mills, A. Philip Randolph, Ibram Kendi again, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Stacey Abrams, Ida B. Wells, Vera Safador, Fannie Lou Hamer, Isabel Wilkerson, Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, Cornel West, James Baldwin, William Lloyd Garrison, Audre Lorde, Bernie Sanders, Michelle Alexander and W.E.B. Du Bois, and on and on and on. I won't read them all, but what a great list we've been developing. So while some of you might be finishing putting some names on them, if you like, let's take some time for a little feedback. What was that exercise like for you? I'd like to hear from maybe 4 or 5 people. If you can be brief, we'll have time for that many to comment. If you don't get in line by raising your hand fast enough this time, there is time at the end for general comments and responses. So what was that exercise in your small group like for you, other than any technical glitches?
We didn't understand.
And I see Lujira's hand. And remember to raise your hand electronically. We will not see you waving your hand in your window.
The exercise would have been fine, except we got hung up on the anti-racist thought.
Okay.
That word anti-racist just sort of created a problem for at least 2 of us.
Okay. Anyone else? Let's see, Paula.
So I felt very stupid. Like it was hard to come up with names until people started going, oh, how about this? Then it started to come, but at first it was very hard.
Yeah, because other than a few periods of history, we don't learn about this stuff. How about you, Stan?
It was more challenging than I expected,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah.
Okay, Steve?
Well, it was easy to think of Black names, but it was harder to think of white names. But we were rattling them off, and we got the group of 3 of us got 17 names, and I thought that was pretty damn good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a limited time period too. Yeah. Okay. So thank you all for helping to make that part of tonight happen and for your comments. I'm really glad to see that you have named some of the people I'm going to mention tonight, and also glad that some of the people I'm going to be talking about may be new to some of you. So let me get my slides here. And I'm going to open with a poem that some of you may know. It's from the 19th century, about 170 years ago, by the poet James Russell Lowell. This poem was long known by the title Stanzas on Freedom. And some have adapted this to music, and it's been used as a congregational song. I believe it's in the old Ethical Culture Songbook from the 60s, and in Unitarian Universalist churches, among others, although not so much since maybe the 70s, as the music used is often kind of plodding and the poem is really complex to sing. So here I'm going to use the rewritten version from the 20th century of this poem. All whose boast it is that we come of forebears brave and free, if there breathe on earth a slave, are we truly free and brave? If we do not feel the chain when it works another's pain, are we not base slaves indeed, slaves unwilling to be freed? Is true freedom but to break fetters for our own dear sake, and with leathern hearts forget we owe humankind a debt? No, true freedom is to share all the chains that others wear, and with heart and hand to be earnest to make others free. They are slaves who fear to speak for the fallen and the weak. They are slaves who will not choose hatred, scoffing, and abuse. Rather than in silence shrink from the truth they needs must think. They are slaves who dare not be in the right with 2 or 3. Well, as I mentioned, it's slightly edited from Lowell's time. Lowell's original had specific roles in it for men and women, with men doing the political work and women mainly thought of in their role as giving birth to new men. I will add that James Russell Lowell came to his views on abolition via his wife, Mary White Lowell. Now, just to be clear about the boundaries that I'm going to be using in talking about this topic, I'm talking mostly today about the history of racism and anti-racism in the US as it relates to how people of European descent have thought of and behaved towards people of African descent. And I'm using today definitions of racism and anti-racism in the spirit that Ibram Kendi uses them. In particular, anti-Black racism, as I'm using the term, really means three different things. First, it's racism is expressing ideas about the general inferiority of people of African descent, called Black, or general superiority of people of European descent. And of course, other people have been adopted into whiteness through US history. Or it can be about attributing any unequal outcomes to those called Black and those called white to the natural or cultural inferiority of those called Black, or the natural or cultural superiority of those called white. Or racism can be support, passive or active, for policies and institutionalized practices that result in people called Black having worse outcomes than people called white. And so to be anti-racist is to express beliefs of equality rather than inferiority and superiority of these groups of people. And it's to attribute inequality that happens in our society to policies, including institutionalized practices, rather than natural characteristics of the groups. And it can also be to actively work to end policies and practices that are racist. Now, if you want to argue those definitions, that's another conversation for a different day. This is what I'm using for this workshop. I'm also choosing to bring the history only up to about the mid-20th century, times that we are usually just not taught about, and most of us here didn't consciously live through. I could include others. When I tell people that my mother was involved in civil rights activism to integrate restaurants, they imagine the South of the 50s or 60s. No, my mother actually did demonstrations to integrate restaurants in Minneapolis in the 1930s. Much of anti-racist history, just like much of racism, is not known. So James Russell Lowell, in his poem, was talking to the white people of his day, particularly to progressives of the time. Now, yes, the term progressive is anachronistic for the early 20th century, for early 19th century rather, but it's the best general word for those who believed in the worth and dignity of every person. And it's worth acknowledging, I think, that Lowell, while he was being anti-racist in his work for abolitionism, was also racist in the sense that he believed in a natural superiority of white people. As Kendi's work makes clear, it's not helpful to think of people as racist or anti-racist by character identity, but by what they are doing in the moment, what they are believing and saying and acting on. You know, back to that poem, if there breathe on earth a slave, are we truly free and brave? Lowell, despite his beliefs about inferiority and superiority, also believed that being free was something that every person, Black and white, deserved, simply for being a human being. And Lowell also recognized a central fact about American history, that we have called this the land of the free and the home of the brave, while enslaving millions of people, denying them basic human equality, or while not actively working to end that enslavement. Now, in the news recently, a lot has been critical race theory. I don't want to quibble about what exactly that means and includes. What I do know is that those who are opposing it actively are against teaching that in any way the US is not founded on pure and completely ethical principles, and against teaching that any kind of racism was part of our founding. They don't want that taught in the public schools, maybe not even in our universities, given some recent tenure battles. So while there's an organized effort right now to make critical race theory some kind of monster, the ideas of race being foundational in our country's history is not a new idea. James Russell Lowell was writing poetry about that paradox that has been at the center of American history since the 1600s. And he was writing that 170 years ago. You know, we claim a country of equality and yet commit racism in word and deed. If there breathe on earth a slave, are we truly free and brave? Oh, and by the way, he wrote this poem for an abolitionist newspaper, demonstrating quite clearly that not only was racism present and strong in that phase of our history, but anti-racism was also present, and not just in individuals, in an organized way. The nation's values included freedom, but denied that freedom to people that even writers of those documents on freedom on a daily basis enslaved in their own homes. These days, many people are boycotting the National Football League for likely collusion of the owners in keeping Colin Kaepernick from working as a quarterback because of his decision to protest during the national anthem. Just such hypocrisy. In a land that called itself the land of the free and the home of the brave when the song was written, millions of people of African descent were treated as property, not humans that could be free and brave. The Star-Spangled Banner, you may have learned in school, was originally written to celebrate the defeat of the British by the Americans in the War of 1812. It too was originally a poem before it became a song. And in the original third verse of that poem, the author refers to the slave who fled in terror or was killed, a reference to the units of Black enslaved men who the British recruited to fight for their side on the promise of emancipation. The Battle of Fort McHenry, celebrated in the poem that became the national anthem, saw the defeat of those Black troops. Another 6,000 formerly enslaved people had gone over to the British side and were emancipated by the British. And when the Americans won the war, the Americans demanded their property back. The British settled most of them in Canada instead, and some went from there to Trinidad. That's part of history we probably didn't learn in school. Yes, there was organized Black resistance that far back. In fact, if you read the Declaration of Independence all the way through, in the last complaint about the British, not only is that last complaint a quite racist reference to the Native Americans, but buried in there is a complaint that the British were supporting insurrections, which meant rebellions by enslaved people. Just this week, somebody challenged my view that we could call any founder's ideas racist or their behavior, asserting that nobody knew better at the time of the Declaration. Well, rebellions of those enslaved would counter that view unless you think they're part of nobody. Some historians have noted that the growing abolitionism in British culture and places of power may have been one of the motivations in 1776 for some of those Americans to hasten a split before their own enslaved people were free. Racism has been part of American history since the Europeans first arrived in 1492. Killing and enslaving of the indigenous Americans began immediately. This was followed by an edict from Queen Isabella of Spain that Native Americans had souls and therefore could not be enslaved. Well, that edict was violated often, but the edict also meant that the Spanish began to look elsewhere for the labor they desired to take full advantage of the resources of this new land. And this new land that they believed they had the right to exploit by right of conquest. So back to my slides. Ships brought people from Africa. They were coming to the Caribbean for many years before the first people from Africa were brought to Virginia in August of 1619 and sold at the first slave auction in what became the United States. Over the next decades, economic interest in preserving the property model for enslavement meant that each successive set of laws were passed defined more broadly how enslavement was to work. In 1691, the word white first appeared in the laws. Whiteness didn't exist before then. Before that, people were identified as English when the laws wanted them treated differently, but more Germans and Dutch and French were arriving on the continent. So using the word white was a way of distinguishing those of European descent from two other groups. Those of African descent, who at the time were called Africans, Blacks, Negroes, and the indigenous people of the time, usually called Indians. Why did the law need to make those distinctions? To be clear that people of European descent, even those brought as indentured servants, were not to be considered property in one case, and in the other case were not to be considered savages. But almost from the beginning, there were also people who opposed the idea of enslavement. In 1688, the British author Aphra Behn published an anti-slavery novel. It was an emotional appeal that was part of the beginnings of organized opposition to enslavement in the British Empire. In the 1600s, some of those increasingly restrictive laws were designed to keep those who enslaved people from freeing them, which, if there's laws to keep people from doing something, leads us to conclude that there were people who were freeing the enslaved people. The first slave revolt in New York State, or what became New York State, was in 1712. The colony's legislature responded to that revolt by authorizing punishment, including the death penalty for enslaved persons, and by making it economically even more difficult for those enslaving people to free anyone. The threads of both race-based enslavement and opposition to holding human beings as property both wove their way through American history from the beginning. And the opposition, as well as the pro-slavery beliefs and practices, were both North and South, and the opposition was both Black and white. In the 1770s, as white Americans began to demand their freedom from British rule, some enslaved people and their allies heard the talk and applied it to themselves. So here we have Phyllis Wheatley, who was born in Africa and sold in Boston. She wrote some of her poems about the emotional reality of being enslaved. The formal movement to oppose enslavement led Vermont to abolish slavery in its constitution in 1777. A woman known as Mumbet and later as Elizabeth Freeman legally challenged slave ownership in Massachusetts. The courts, when they heard this case, found that there was no basis for enslavement in the new Constitution, and the courts in Massachusetts essentially abolished slavery. African American men in that state were able to vote at that time. By 1790, the census in Massachusetts found no enslaved people there. And here's someone who is more familiar to most people, Sojourner Truth, born enslaved in New York. She fought in court for her rights during New York's gradual emancipation period. So the enslavement of millions of people was never a very stable institution because it was always being challenged. And it had to be maintained by increasingly restrictive laws that were meant to counter the challenges to it. And then increasingly restrictive laws meant increasing opposition. A few who were enslaved, many formerly enslaved people, and some so-called white people became more and more active and organized. The more restrictive enslavement became, the more outraged were some looking on, and the more determined to end it were some who were directly affected. The US Constitution, as you likely know, was in several ways a compromise between those states which definitely wanted to preserve enslavement and those states increasingly opposed to continuing or expanding enslavement. One of the compromises in the Constitution was ending the importing of slaves in 1808, although some 250,000 enslaved people were brought in after 1808 in violation of that constitutional provision. And the more opposition there was to the institution, the more rigid the institution became. The year that men and women of the slave ship Amistad successfully demanded that the US recognize their freedom, that same year, North Carolina banned the teaching of any enslaved people to read and write, and Alabama banned preaching by any African Americans, free or enslaved. Now read between the lines. Reading and writing proved a way that aided people to envision freedom and then organize to seek it. Preaching was one way of inspiring and organizing people to value, seek, and win their freedom. Racism and anti-racism evolved together in history, much like in natural evolution, when prey evolves ways to escape, predators also adapt. By the 1830s and 1840s, within some progressive white communities, especially in the North, advocacy against enslavement was becoming ever more organized. Many of the people involved came from religious groups that broke free of the old idea that all humankind are primarily sinners. They instead saw the hope and potential within every person. These were religions that tended to see the individual soul as striving for fulfillment and growth, and thus freedom for all was essential. It's not surprising that the same groups also were the source often of women calling for equality and human rights for themselves. The Fugitive Slave Act and the Dred Scott decision both addressed some of the concerns of the enslavers and responded to the increasing abolitionism. But as a result, in these new decisions and the new law, increased abolitionist and anti-slavery activism. States which had abolished enslavement saw the Fugitive Slave Act and the Dred Scott decision as infringements on their states' rights, forcing those states to enforce a system that that state had abolished. So some more pictures. One of the interesting and less well-known abolitionists of that time was a man named Moncure Conway. Born into a family that enslaved people to work in their home and their factory, Moncure Conway was part of the Virginia founding families. He came from the Virginia founding families. Peter Vivian Daniel was Moncure Conway's grandfather's brother. And Peter Daniel was part of the US Supreme Court, which supported enslavement in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the Dred Scott decision of 1857. Moncure, step by step, became anti-slavery and eventually moved to the North, where he was part of the crowd that tried to free Anthony Burns in an act of resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act. Conway moved to England during the US Civil War on a mission to try to keep England from entering the war on the side of the Confederacy. Later, as you may know, if his name is familiar to you, he became an ethical culture leader in England. James Russell Lowell's poem was among many that sought to connect the American call for freedom, inclusion, and equality with the hypocrisy of treating many people as mere property. Black poets were also writing emotional appeals from their experience. So we have Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who's about the same period as Moncure Conway. She was a freeborn African-American, became active in abolitionism. So listen to some of her words. She had just come from an abolitionist gathering of Black and white activists, a gathering which had talked about this American split personality from the beginning. She wrote, "I never saw so clearly the nature and intent of the Constitution before. Oh, was it not strangely inconsistent that men so fresh from the baptism of the Revolution should make such concessions to the foul spirit of despotism, that when fresh from gaining their own liberty, they could permit the African slave trade, could let their national flag hang a sign of death on Guinea's coast and Congo's shore. 21 years the slave ships of the Republic could gorge the sea monsters with their prey. 21 years of mourning and desolation for the children of the tropics to gratify the avarice and cupidity of men styling themselves free. And then the dark intent of the fugitive clause, veiled under words so specious that a stranger unacquainted with our nefarious government would not know that such a thing was meant by it. Alas, for these fatal concessions." So, it's really not new that people had figured out that there were restrictive laws that were this dual personality in American history. And the increasingly restrictive laws by the states favoring enslavement were accompanied by pressure to expand the territory where enslavement was legal. This was increasingly met by active resistance to enslavement. The two opposites finally exploded in the American Civil War. States which seceded all cited the major reason for secession as slavery. And while states that did not secede cited unity and union as their reason for fighting secession, it was probably inevitable that the war would, if won by the North, end the legal institution of enslavement. And in fact, it did. The story of what happened after that end of legal enslavement is a story that has been told different ways in different times. What just about everyone does agree on is this: while the states which had tried to secede were under strict control of the federal government, hundreds and hundreds of formerly enslaved people joined the governments and exercised real legal authority. Many people, many of them formerly abolitionists, but many idealistic others as well, went to the South to provide education to those who had been legally denied education. Some of these people who went South were free Blacks from the North. Some were formerly enslaved people who had been able to get educations surreptitiously. And others were white allies who believed that equality would be made more real when education was made more equal. The 1870s began with the right to vote extended legally in all states without regard to race, color, or former condition of servitude. Now, the myth of decades of school history classes is that the formerly enslaved people and the people coming from the North made a mess of it all. And thus the Southerners had to reassert their power to provide more stability. What is true, I believe, is that those who had formerly been in power and defended enslavement came back into power, asserting that only they could reestablish stability. And by that they meant be back in power. What is also true is that the idea of incompetent Black people and oppressive white Northern opportunists is a story that was convenient for those wanting to reassert white supremacy in the states that had seceded. And it's a story that does not hold up well under scrutiny. So another slide here. As a side note here, I want to mention that one of the major textbook writers about American history in the early 20th century was our movement's own David Muzzy. As I have detailed in another talk, which is available on the New York Society's website, Muzzy was a significant influence on generations through his textbooks on American history, widely used in the schools. In these books, he unabashedly declared the Civil War was a war to end enslavement. He also supported the view that immigrants made the country great and were not to be feared. And he was writing at a time when there were growing restrictions on immigration. He was called a Bolshevik by the right wing of his time, and he is still subjected to denouncements by those who want to teach that the South was merely exercising its annoyance with federalism in seceding. Muzzy was also part of educating those generations of students in the myth that the formerly enslaved were incompetent and that the white Southerners had to clean up the mess. The Dunning School of Reconstruction, which was a history set of ideas that was widely taught in this country through the mid-20th century, the Dunning School was centered at Columbia University. Muzzy taught at Barnard in addition to serving as an ethical culture leader. I admit I learned his version in my US history classes in high school. It took a Black history course in college for me to begin to see that there was a lot of evidence for different perspectives. And if you don't know who Robert Smalls is, after we're done, just go and read about him. It is true that racism in very explicit ways increased its power, reacting to that period called Reconstruction. After the end of formal Reconstruction was brought by white supremacy, anti-Black racism was ever more codified into new laws and practices. What is also true is that work against racism and white supremacy became less visible. What is not true is that it disappeared. Black institutions did develop and thrive against tough odds, even after white supremacy ended Reconstruction. I quoted Frances Ellen Watkins Harper earlier. She lectured from the end of the Civil War until her death in 1911 on civil rights for African Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois cited her as an inspiration as the thread of anti-racism continued with him into the 20th century. Frederick Douglass continued after the war and after Reconstruction ended, continued to lecture and to promote projects to oppose racism until his death in 1895. By that time, the older activists were dying, but new activists had been nurtured and inspired by them into new forms of activism. So again, the two were developing together, racism and anti-racism. The same year that Tennessee passed the first Jim Crow laws, which was 1881, Spelman College was founded by two women from Massachusetts, Harriet Giles and Sophia Packard. They had first come to Atlanta to found a school for newly freed Black women, and then expanded that with money from the Rockefellers. John D. Rockefeller's wife's family, the Spelmans, had been abolitionists. New organizations were founded, schools were founded, books were published. The first public anti-lynching activism began in 1892 with Ida B. Wells. Anti-racism didn't die with the end of Reconstruction. Some, like Booker T. Washington, advocated accommodation and moderation as a response. Others, like W.E.B. Du Bois, supported a more radical approach to winning rights and inclusion. You know, many white allies who did continue their work at the time emphasized working to support movements movements and institutions that were led by African Americans. So at this point in history, most of the white allies were letting African Americans take the lead and supporting their work. Some white former abolitionists supported Booker T. Washington's approach. Some were active in the anti-lynching work of Ida B. Wells. Some encouraged and supported W.E.B. Du Bois. Some turned on and betrayed the cause of anti-racism, even though they had been abolitionists earlier. Before, during, and after the Civil War, one of the strongest white voices for immediate action against racism was William Lloyd Garrison. He continued publishing his abolitionist newspaper from 1831 through the abolishment of slavery in the US Constitution after the war. Just a side note, a couple of months ago, Ibram Kendi and others started an anti-racism online newspaper under the umbrella of the Boston Globe. In the spirit of Garrison's newspaper, they are calling it the Emancipator. William Lloyd Garrison Jr., who was son of William Lloyd Garrison, was an activist. He promoted tax reform, women's suffrage, and he actively worked against the Chinese Exclusion Act, a law which was another post-Civil War eruption of white supremacy. Another of Garrison's sons became literary editor of the Nation magazine. And that editor's daughter, so granddaughter of William Lloyd Garrison, married a man who had been a war correspondent in the Civil War, a German immigrant who went on to make a fortune in railroad investments. And after their children were grown and after her husband died, and now that she had his fortune, she became very active in the women's suffrage movement and early 20th century peace movement. A grandson of her would become the first male president of Planned Parenthood of New York City. Fanny's son was Oswald Garrison Villard. He was therefore the great-grandson of William Lloyd Garrison. Villard carried on the family tradition of anti-racism. He was part of the Anti-Imperialist League, which opposed American occupation of the territories seized by the US in the Spanish-American War. He actively opposed Woodrow Wilson when President Wilson segregated the federal workforce. He published a biography of John Brown. And with perhaps the most impact on the next generation, on the next phase of anti-racism in America, he joined with others in calling for a meeting in response to race riots, which had targeted African Americans in several cities with violence. That meeting formally organized the NAACP, and he was, with his mother, W.E.B. Du Bois, and others, founders of that organization. And by the way, Villard early on started as a believer in laissez-faire economics, later became a supporter of the New Deal, and near the end of his life, debated Ayn Rand on collectivism versus individualism in economics. Well, Oswald Villard was an example of how the old abolitionist movement didn't just inspire the activism of the early 20th century. It was directly connected to that earlier movement, and the values had been passed down. So a small example of how anti-racist work often was nourished and continued rather quietly in those decades is our own ethical culture movement. I'm often surprised how few of us know some of these pieces of our history. We are just one small example of many others. Our movement began in 1876, founded by a generation who had lived through the American Civil War. Most early members in ethical culture saw the Civil War as a fight against enslavement and for equality. Many were involved in early ethical societies in supporting Black institutions financially and with volunteers as the backlash and Jim Crow reversed many gains. Felix Adler, the young and first leader of an ethical society, spoke as one of his first talks to that first society about the ethics of John Brown. Was Brown justified in promoting violence, trying to arm enslaved people with guns and pikes so that they could rebel? As the 20th century began, some ethical culture societies debated the pluses and minuses of the approaches of Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois and Adler struck up not just a political relationship, they had a friendship, including social dinners with each other and their wives. Some of the story of Adler and Du Bois you may have experienced in an artistic adaptation by ethical culture leader Jay Hooper in his film Humanitas. Du Bois and Adler together created what was a promising anti-racist institution, the first Universal Races Congress, meeting for 4 days in London in 1911 with 2,100 attendees from around the world. This was an explicitly anti-racist effort meant to improve race relations and inclusion of all races. The conference included scientific criticism of the very concept of race in an early recognition of the myth of race, yet the fact of racism. The Congress challenged ideas of racial purity, as well as that idea of race as a biological reality. It included not only African Americans and Africans speaking for themselves, but Native American speakers advocating for Native American rights, Muslims and Asians. So-called white people who attended included social reformers like Jane Addams and John Dewey. A South African lawyer of Indian descent was in attendance at that race conference, Mohandas Gandhi. These people were conscious of meeting in the capital of Anglo-Saxon Empire, and yet advocating for a very different vision of the world. This Congress, when it was ending, decided it would meet every 4 years, only every 4 years because travel was expensive and difficult. But then World War II intervened, and sadly, that race Congress was never repeated. The ethical culture movement hosted and participated in national anti-lynching congresses. For a period after the First World War, several of our societies, including New York and Brooklyn, included key members of the Black intelligentsia of the time. James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the poem that begins with the phrase, "Lift every voice and sing," was a member for a time of the New York Society. Cora Calhoun Horn was a member before she moved on to become a Baha'i. She traced her heritage to the so-called Black Calhouns, African-American descendants of the pro-slavery John Calhoun. She also raised her granddaughter, Lena Horn, sending her to an ethical culture school. These people were among those who built Black institutions after the Civil War and into the 20th century, and some of them were related to our movement. Elaine Locke, sometimes called the Dean of the Harlem Renaissance, had connections with the New York Society. Even more than Du Bois, Locke was an advocate of the idea that race is not a biological reality, but a social and cultural construct. What white anti-racists who were nurtured by their ethical culture connections include, here he is again, Oswald Garrison Villard. He was a member of the New York Society. Mary White Ovington, while never a member, was a childhood friend of Felix Adler's wife, and she was a frequent visitor to the New York Society and to the Adler home. Ethical culture leaders Anna Garland Spencer and Henry Moskowitz were part of the call for creating the NAACP, along with Villard and Mary White Ovington. And those two had already been long active in anti-racism work. So while we were a very small movement, always, we were part of that part of American culture that nurtured and supported anti-racist work, even when it was not drawing the level of public attention that the abolitionists before and civil rights movement later did. Certainly not drawing enough attention to get any of this into your history books in school. So one last connector that I want to point to as symbolic of how the anti-racist tradition sometimes continued quite literally as a family affair Early abolitionists during the enslavement period included Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were daughters of a family that enslaved people. The two sisters became Quakers and came to advocate for ending enslavement based on their concept of human worth and equality, for them rooted in their religious faith. The sisters also became early advocates of women's rights, when some tried to say that as women, they had no right to advocate publicly for human rights. So after the Civil War, the two sisters discovered that one of their brothers, Henry, after his wife's death, began a relationship with an enslaved woman of both African and European mixed descent. Her name was Nancy Weston. Now, such relationships at that time are always problematic when we consider the issues around free consent. From evidence of the time, Henry treated it as a committed relationship. It was impossible legally to marry, and almost impossible under the laws of the time for him to free Nancy or their children. This brother died in 1852, and in his will tried to be sure that the sons they had together would be treated as members of the family. Well, that failed. The two sons were treated no differently from others who were enslaved by those assigned by the law to inherit power over them. But after the war, the two sons took their father's surname, Grimke, and studied at a post-war freedmen's school. And then each of them decided to go north to college. They became advocates of equal rights, and they soon came to the attention of their two aunts. Sarah and Angelina Grimke had not been aware of their existence, having cut off relationships with their family over the issue of abolition. But once the two aunts found out about these nephews, they supported their nephews financially in their education. Archibald Grimke, one of the sons, attended Harvard University, and Francis attended Howard University, and both became active in the post-war work of the former abolitionists. Francis Grimke, one of them, married Charlotte Fortin, a longtime Black abolitionist and writer from Philadelphia's free Black community, who had taught in freedmen's schools. Francis became a prominent minister, a leading African-American clergyman of his era, serving in Washington, D.C. He was another one of those on the list of people who helped found the NAACP in 1909. The brother Archibald became a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and served for a time as American consul to the Dominican Republic. And Archibald was the father of Angelina Weld Grimke, who became a teacher and writer and a prominent figure in the Harlem Renaissance. She's also known as one of the earliest known African-American lesbian writers. One of her plays was written explicitly as a response and critique of the white supremacist film, Birth of a Nation. Archibald Grimke stayed active in anti-racism work through that latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th. He was associated with Frederick Douglass. His brother Francis officiated at Douglass's second marriage. Archibald disagreed publicly with Booker T. Washington on vocational versus higher education for African Americans. Archibald was part of leading the public protest when Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal government. And he was a founder of and vice president of the NAACP. From the early abolitionists through the 1920s, a family thread of anti-racism. So why do we care that racism has been part of this country from the beginning? I think to understand how it sometimes surges, sometimes retreats, but it is deeply embedded in our culture and the law. If we do not understand what needs to be changed, we will not be effective in changing it, which may be the point of those who don't want this history taught. And why do we care about this thread of anti-racism? I think it's important that we not only recognize that racism has been a constant in American society, but also that anti-racism has always been there. even if the public story of American history does not acknowledge that. We do need, I believe, to acknowledge how persistent racism is, how it works, how it exists with and without animosity toward others. It is systemic as well as ideological. But we also need to study and understand the role and reality of anti-racism. What makes people take a stand against racism? What works to oppose racism? How do people get motivated to oppose and resist? And for those who are parents and educators, how do we pass on those values to another generation? Because this work is not going to be finished in the lifetime of those who are in this room tonight. Racism is an American tradition. The hypocrisy of founding on values of human rights, human dignity, and human freedom, while enslaving millions and killing and expelling millions of others, is a pervasive part of this country's history. Racism ebbs and flows, but there is a thread of it through our history. Roots are deep, and we need to find them to root out racism. But so is there also a thread of anti-racism, and we can learn from that how to become ever more effective in dismantling both ideological and systemic racism. And we don't need to start new. We can connect to the thread of anti-racism through our history. While there breathe on earth a slave, whether it's formal slavery, the involuntary servitude under the 13th Amendment of mass incarceration, or other forms, while there breathe on earth a slave who is really free and brave. When I gave a version of this talk at the Riverdale Society 2.5 years ago, we ended with a song often entitled Lift Every Voice. You know, the one that Vanessa Williams sang at a recent Washington, D.C. July 4th ceremony, and generated a whole lot of criticism, especially by the same people who don't want children to learn about the truth of embedded racism in our culture. This song is another illustration of the kind of connections I've been talking about. Sometimes called the Black National Anthem, it was sung in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, often then at afternoon gatherings in churches throughout the South, rather than as a hymn during the services, because the churches were one safe place to do the organizing. James Weldon Johnson wrote the lyrics as a poem in 1900, and his brother John Rosamond Johnson set it to music in 1905. James Weldon Johnson would later, for some years, regularly attend Sunday meetings at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. Lines from the third stanza of this poem, which we omit here, were used to begin the benediction at the inauguration of President Barack Obama in 2008. In 2018, Beyonce included the song at her concert at the Coachella Valley Music and Arts Festival. It remains an important expression of the trust in a brighter future for African Americans. So I'm going to put the words up for the first two verses, the poem as James Weldon Johnson wrote it, for some moments of reflection. And if you'd really love to hear the first verse during this time, one of our hosts is going to put a link to a YouTube video that you can listen to as we have a couple minutes of meditation time. So now we come to a time for your participation. I'm particularly interested in your comments or reflections on how you think the history of both racism and anti-racism in America can inform the work that we do within our ethical societies. So if you would raise your hand to speak, and please be brief. We'll take as many as we can until it's time to close. Okay, we have Jackie Sims.
My comment is that we certainly could teach the history that you learned in your schools and the history that I believe to be true in ethical culture societies. It's one of the few places that African Americans learned their history in the Black church. And it seems that it would be an appropriate thing for ethical culture to include.
Okay, any other comments or reflections?
Carolyn, is your thumbs up your version of raising hand or just supportive of what was said?
Disagreeing with Jackie.
Okay.
Mhm.
I can't figure out how to do it.
And Amy.
You want to unmute?
Yeah.
So I think that the movement should actively support teaching real history in our public schools. It's some of what we do at the Ethics and Education Network. And I think that we should be, supportive and as active as we can. I just think it's so important.
Yeah, and especially right now when it's under threat, when we just saw in Tennessee, a group of parents file suit to prevent the teaching in US history classes about school desegregation.
Right. And there have been all these bills passed in 8 different states.
Yeah.
Basically, they're saying that it really has nothing to do with critical race theory, which was from law school. I mean, I was in law school at the time, but these bills say that they don't want children to feel uncomfortable, meaning white students feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to some Black families organizing and start talking about how teaching the history incompletely makes them uncomfortable. Nick.
Yeah, my sense is that the story is one of some progress and some backlash. And so I don't think that we're going to have a point at which we have succeeded. I think this is an ongoing effort, and hopefully we will see some progress, but we will always expect something that's going to be a reaction. And we shouldn't be surprised, that that's there. Somehow we should be prepared to confront that and relate to it and build on it. So it is very abstract, but my sense is that that's going to happen or is happening. That's what we're seeing in Tennessee and elsewhere.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is different now is that we have history to look at carefully, and we won't make the mistake of thinking it's done if we make significant progress.
Exactly.
I lived through the civil rights movement. I've done a lot of reading of the activists of the earlier periods. And each time there was this sense of, okay, we finished that. Now, what else do we need to do in this world? And not a sense that, as one author has documented, that each of the 3 major times there have been significant racial progress in this country. There have been significant and often violent
Exactly.
backlashes, and we know that now. That may be a difference. Yeah, Steve.
Okay, so I want to thank you. It was a wonderful history lesson. And, you know, I've read a lot, and you filled in many gaps. I'm sure there are many more. I have one thing that bothers me. I feel, I expressed this to somebody the other day. When we look at the founding, at the Constitution, we have to really think that, I really think that was an advance, politically an advance in
I don't see.
a human in human rights, and we understand, and we see looking back that it wasn't perfect. And you know, the first time you bake a cake, it's not going to come out too well. And hopefully you get a chance to redo it. Of course, it took a long time, and a lot of effort, and a lot of pain, and a civil war, and we still haven't got the cake right. But despite all the problems that they had with slavery at that time, they did get rid of the king, and they did introduce the idea of democracy. It wasn't perfect. Can't we give them some credit for doing that?
I think that when we say that there was a split personality, we are giving credit, and also saying that the same people who said all men are created equal sent out newspaper ads to capture men who worked for them and were treated as property. And to not acknowledge that the two sides of the coin were both there is a mistake. It's also probably true, and this is one of the things there's been more research on by historians recently, that if we had not seceded from the British Empire, slavery would have been abolished earlier, because Britain was already on the road to doing that. And there is some concrete evidence that, especially among the leadership in the southern colonies, that was one reason they wanted independence, was to avoid these, as the Declaration of Independence calls them, insurrections. Part of the purpose of that, it's not just, it was accidental, it was kind of left in as gradual, it was purposely left in, just as there's some good evidence, if you read the Virginia proceedings on the Bill of Rights, that the Second Amendment was put there because the Southerners were afraid that the power of the president to control the militia would be used to abolish slave patrols. And so the right of the states to have militias was embodied in the Bill of Rights.
Of course,
so
it could have
a whole
gone.
nother question. But Steve, the answer to your question is, when you say there's a split personality, you are recognizing that there was good and there was bad, and that they were bundled together is important to know.
You could
Thank
say
you.
that. Well,
Want to move on so others get a chance to speak. So Betty Chia?
Yeah, in the conversation about what we can do in terms of our communities, most of our communities are in the Northeast. And I was thinking just today, remembering what it meant to me as a child on the corner of Mineola Boulevard and Jericho Turnpike in Long Island, where my father took me and stopped me and said to me, "This is where I saw the Ku Klux Klan burn a cross." It's in front of probably an Irish bar in the 1930s, because the problem was not restricted to the South, and the problems continue not to be restricted. And in the way our northern kids take a look at the history, it's of those foreign people. And I don't know how you deal with that, but I think it's really important to see it in the racism in a place like Garden City, and just all over the place. And I think we need to do some look at our own home areas.
Yeah, when I ask groups in New York, when was the last slave in New York state freed? It's interesting to me that everybody under 35, or almost everybody, like 90%, knows the answer. And most of the people over 40 do not know the answer or have it wrong. The answer, by the way, is 1862. Because of the way that New York did the so-called gradual emancipation, there were still a few people who were able to be held as property until 1862. So it's we're getting near the end. We'll take one more question here. We'll take Anna. And I'm willing to stay after the 9:30 to continue with anyone else who has questions or comments.
Awesome. Thanks, Joan. I'm actually raising my hand for Betty. Betty, you guys can go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, we have somebody on the phone. Can you introduce yourself with your name and where you are from?
Hi, Jake Aronov. I'm from Chicago.
Okay.
My question is, you talk about the anti-racism movement. What's the difference between the civil rights movement versus the anti-racism movement? What's the difference?
Okay, I tried to define anti-racism as I'm using it early. Anti-racism is to express beliefs about human equality rather than that one group is superior and another is inferior. It is to attribute differences in outcomes of these large groups of people to policies and practices, not to group inferiority and superiority. And it is to work on policies and practices that end the racist disparities that exist in the current policies and practices. So by that means, yes, civil rights would be a kind of anti-racism. Yeah,
Okay,
Kendi invented, Kendi didn't invent the term, it had been long used. But the idea was to differentiate the so-called non-racist, who are people who are bystanders, essentially, and say, I'm not a racist, so I don't have to do anything, from people who are actively working to end policies and procedures rather than policies and practices rather than to stand by and permit them to continue. Okay, so I have some closing words, and I know that Anna also has an announcement, but I'll do the closing words first. For closing words, I've chosen these from Lena Horne, who I briefly mentioned in my talk. And it's a reminder that the trust in this kind of work is built on reliability, and reliability is built on consistent action. She said in an earlier time, nobody, black or white, who really believes in democracy can stand aside now. Everybody's got to stand up and be counted. So Anna, you have, I think, some announcements.
Yeah, thank you everybody for sticking around. I'm just popping a link in the chat right now for our feedback form. We'd love to hear from you. So if you'd like to fill that out, that would be great. If you can't open it right now because you have Zoom running, no worries. I will be sending it out to all attendants. So that's it. Thanks, Joan.
Will anybody be staying after 9:30?
Yeah, I'll stay if there's other comments or questions people want to share.
Jira Cooper has raised her hand.
Hi, Lajira.
Hey, Joan. I found the talk very intriguing, and I found the thread of it just going down through the ages to be the kind of thing I don't think we know enough about.
Right.
And the challenge is to remember this as we move forward and not try to reinvent the wheel.
Mhm.
The fight continues.
Yeah, and I think also for me, it's, if the thread did continue, sometimes within families, what does that mean about what we can learn about how to teach the next generation? Because it is a myth that all young people are not racist or that they are anti-racist. There were a lot of young people carrying Confederate flags in January 6th at the US Capitol.
Yeah.
Very few baby boomers in that crowd.
I'd like to say a few words to follow up on Johnson. His daughter was trained as a teacher in the ethical culture schools and went on to form the Harlem Academy, which is based on some of the things that she learned from training in the ethical culture schools. And that's part of the family legacy. But I think it is important at times when things look bad, when we're going backwards, to remember that every small little thing you do can be an influence, just as the training of Johnson's daughter, empowered her to form the Harlem Academy, and it's a ripple effect.
Yep. Yeah, and a corollary to that is that anti-racist work isn't just done by white people. So times in history, like in the late 19th, early 20th century, when most of the white allies were supporting Black institutions and efforts, it didn't mean that there wasn't anti-racist work going on because the whites weren't in the lead. And I think that's one of the unconscious assumptions that's made in some of the history classes, is that there's not anti-racism work going on unless white people are there and visible. And I think retrieving the history of Black anti-racism work is also very important, from the slave rebellions onwards. The few of you here who are from Philadelphia, retrieving some of the awesome history of the anti-slavery movement in Philadelphia, which was a coalition of white and Black men and women. It was a really interesting coalition, far ahead of its time in many ways, and not well known.
Joan, do you have any thoughts about what we might do to learn more about our history or get more of our... I don't mean to derail this, but you've named a lot of names and placed it in the context of ethical culture in a way that's been very enlightening.
Yeah, a few people have done some of the work. Is Bob Burson still here? I know he did some work on retrieving the connection with Elaine Locke. I don't think he's still here. But a lot of it hasn't been put together, in part because ethical culture hasn't been that interested in writing its own history, and in part because that coalition early in the 20th century got lost. And it got lost probably for the same reasons that the Black Renaissance got lost, that there was a backlash and the Depression, which was much harder on people of color than on white people. And it was pretty hard on white people. It meant a real backward step in a lot of race relations.
There's another thing that might be considered, and I thought of it as you were speaking today. When I went to work for the Civil Rights Commission in the late 1960s, we saw a film that was in the archives on a race in America in the 1930s, made by the U.S. government, I presume, under the FBI. And it was a shocker to me, because what it was saying is that the only people who were concerned about the issue of racism, or we'll use the other word, doing anti-racist work, were the communists. And it went through this whole 30, I guess 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And there are lots of reasons that lots of people in the room were just horrified and shocked about it. And I on the other hand, knew enough of a couple of the demonstrations to know that that was legitimate in some cases, and but that people were fearful of telling their children what they had done. And I think that it's important to look at that. And it's hard for me to put this together, but to look at that and the impact that Mr. Hoover has had on the way that we tell the history of people who stood up, because to stand up was in the 30s, in the 20s, was to be a communist in our society. And, I would like to give those who were communists and stood up should get some credit for doing it if nobody else was doing anything. But more importantly, I think it's greatly distorted the way we look at anti-racist activity in America and the silence of white people.
The 30s are an interesting time because, again, a lot of the anti-racist work was being done quietly. And into the 40s, when the New Deal really tried to communicate, okay, we're doing something for a lot of people, so shut up about that we're not helping Black people. And so there was some deliberate suppression of that. So, for instance, you had really good new labor laws that exempted farm workers and domestics very deliberately. Who were overrepresented in those groups?
Blacks.
People of color. And there was a lot of be quiet for the sake of the greater good. And A. Philip Randolph broke through that in the 40s when he infamously threatened FDR that if he did not integrate the armed forces, that Randolph was going to organize a march on Washington, which would stop the war industry. And FDR buckled because he knew that Randolph had an organization. The whole history of the sleeping car porters and how it was one of the forces for racial good is pretty amazing. One of the little known facts about the sleeping car porters was that if you were a steward or a union official, often your wife ran a beauty parlor. And so if you got fired from your railroad job, you could still survive. And so there was a lot of effort. Madam C.J. Walker, who is, often just known as the first Black millionaire, or at least the first Black woman millionaire, there's some contention around that. She required her owners of beauty shops to give at least 10% of their funds to helping their race. And often that was given to anti-racist causes that were going on in that time period. but that were mostly within the Black community. So the story didn't get told in the white community, and the authors of textbooks never heard it. Or like Muzzy, they didn't believe it.
Caller on the phone?
Yes, hello. I did have a question.
Sure.
Oh, okay. I just wondered how many of us, since I can't see who's there, how many of us are there now?
Well, there's still
reviewing?
20 people left.
No kidding. Wow, that's
And
great. Well, I'm Zabby, and I'm from the Suffolk Society, and I'm just wondering. I I have a few
We had a Suffolk
questions
book.
in the one
What?
question. Can you and I'm wondering how many of the people present are accepting or accepting the label of any of them are comfortable. Let me use that word since it was brought up before. And yes, I have heard that out there, that the comfortable with being labeled by, well, one author who wrote the White Fragility book. The White Fragility book, but the idea that are you all of you comfortable, or any of you comfortable with accepting the guilt and the label of being a white supremacist?
Zabby, I'm just going to say most of that is really off the topic for tonight.
Okay.
It's a kind of a side topic. I would
Okay.
say that most of those who, like me, think that white people need to know more about what white people have done in the past are not doing it in order to make people feel guilty, because feeling guilty is a reaction that often leads people to focus on themselves and not the issue. So feeling guilty is yet another way that some white people can keep the attention on themselves, and rather than learning from what's happened and moving on to doing
Right.
something
Okay.
differently.
Okay. And you're absolutely right about that. And I would like to retract that, because I just, forget about the guilt part that's could or could not be associated with it. I've heard people talking about that, and I personally don't accept that I'm a white supremacist, and I don't think that people who are anti-racist
Okay. Well, let me just.
are white supremacists. But
Okay.
that's the only
Yeah,
reason
the
I brought
language,
it up.
the language is a little bit technical for that area. White supremacy, as it's defined in the field of anti-racism, is any belief or practice which puts white people on the top. So if there's any place in your life where you accept that, you know, the cops are going to stop you less often than somebody your same age, gender, income level who is Black, that is a white, that is part of white supremacy, that meaning white people are on top of the hierarchy.
I see.
And white supremacist is something that we tend to use for explicit believers in that system who want to explicitly work to maintain it.
Right. So I don't think it should be generalized. That's what I was trying to ask.
Well, my generalization is that every one of us who is white benefits from white supremacy, and in some ways, because we can't do everything, even if we're very active, help it to continue.
Right. Isn't that, though, the white privilege, as that at least the Black I think that's distinguished from the white supremacy. That's the white privilege if you're participating because of the privileges that are given to you because of the people out there who are at the top of the hierarchy, which I'm
Yeah,
not at the
that
top.
there are just privileges, meaning unearned advantages of being
Correct.
white in our society, and whiteness is something that gets socially defined. You know,
Right,
whiteness
and not-
originally only meant Europeans, and even then, you know, Ben Franklin did not think that Germans were white. There was a time in the early 19th century when the Scandinavians weren't white. The Irish weren't white, and they got adopted. You have people from the Middle East are sometimes considered white, sometimes not.
I would like to add something.
Yeah, but whiteness was invented in order to give advantages to people called white. There wouldn't be whiteness otherwise.
And I think also because they didn't want the English and or the Irish, rather the Irish and the Germans, or especially the Irish who were indentured slaves, to get together and unite with the black slaves.
Yeah, I would not call the Irish slaves. They were indentured servants who were often treated badly.
Right, indentured.
But slavery in the United States is a peculiar institution, as the Southerners used to call it, where it is a race-based, multi-generational, being treated as property, pure and simple, with no other rights.
We have another person. Is it Zakia?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what I wanted to say is that we have come pretty far as far as taking care of the racism. But the reality is that if we do not, as a nation, if we do not get rid of this white racism, white bigotry and policing and all these things, there is so much more needs to be done. And if we can do something about it, instead of just talking about it, maybe, maybe we can make some more progress. Floyd, what was his name? Floyd. I think his death has made people to wake up and see the reality, what is happening. And there were white people who were supporting the black people in that kind of situation. These kind of things we need to see more often, not by killing someone, but by action. So what we can do as humans, black and white, all together as a nation.
So George Floyd, certainly, his murder certainly triggered a lot of people to think. There is some research that came out recently that said that the percentage of white people who believe that black people are more subject to police violence than white people went up. More white people believed that last year. It has now gone down below where it was before. So the backlash has diminished considerably the learnings of last year. And that's something really to take a deep breath and think about. What does that mean? That, for instance, that 55% of people we call white in this country either don't believe that racism exists anymore, or they think that racism against white people is more than racism against black people. 55% of people who are white either dismiss that there is a need for any work on racism because they don't think it exists, or because they think it's gone too far, and that white people are the real people discriminated against now. And that's worth thinking about. What does it mean if you want policies passed if you have 55% of white people on that side. And sadly, it has not changed a whole lot in the last year and a half.
I would say that it is not just white people's responsibility or just Black people, that they need to work harder. I think it is a collective responsibility. And if we don't work on it as a nation, and this is not going to happen, unfortunately.
Right. And of course, there's other versions of, you know, white people being at the top of the hierarchy that also cause problems in our country. My choice tonight was to just focus on the one, not that the others don't exist. But yeah, I mean, how do you get a collective responsibility going until we work on some of the resistance, and which is growing within the larger, you know, which is still a majority of US voters are white people. I put in chat one of the books. It's pretty academic, but I find it a really helpful book. Eduardo Bonilla Silva wrote Racism Without Racists. Parts of it are a little dated, but any statistics that he's got in there, you can find similar statistics now that are very similar. And he talks about how the explicit racists who are, you know, spewing the nasty language and the horrible statements, they're actually not as big a problem as the people who think we're all colorblind now, we can just go on from here, you know, start with where we are now and just, you know, everybody's on the same plane. And he does, I think, a really good job in the sociological parts. I disagree with some of his political solutions at the end, but they also made me think a lot. And Betty, I want to say something about, you know, earlier you said something about the Communist Party and racism, anti-racism in especially the 30s. Because I remember my mother talking about that. And I've looked into it and have had friends who, you know, either they or their parents were party members then and later. And one of the things was that there was very little white organized opposition to racism. And so the Communist Party saw it as a wonderful political opportunity and also a way to play into the criticism that the USSR was able to have of that the United States had no leg to stand on in promoting democracy, given what was going on in America with racism. So, you know, it was part of an overall package there, but it's also not true that the only anti-racist activity was there. There were, for instance, some of the women in federal agencies in the New Deal who were beginning to help families with children and people like that. They were subversively often including Black families in that and trying to work around a system at the federal level that was trying to get them not to pay attention to that part of society. And one of the most famous, of course, was Eleanor Roosevelt, who partly from her early life working in settlement houses, which most people don't know, she was a volunteer in settlement houses before she got married. She did a lot of work in the 30s and 40s around refusing to give in to racism. You know, her infamous meeting in the South where the authorities allowed a meeting with both Black and white as long as they sat on different sides of the room. And Eleanor infamously put her chair in the aisle as her act of resistance to that, knowing that if she did otherwise, the meeting would be shut down, but it was her way of saying, I'm not part of that decision. And people may know that Eleanor Roosevelt was also one of the key idealists helping to form the encampment for citizenship after the war, which very deliberately brought teenagers of all economic classes, colors, religions together on the assumption that only if people learned to live with each other and work out their conflicts across all these lines could we really say that we had a democracy.
I should mention that the talk last night about Hubert Harrison was very interesting, and mentioned that he was a very ardent socialist until the socialists decided that they were going to have a white only approach, and he broke with them pretty radically, pretty strongly at that point. I wonder why the socialists did that. I wonder if that was because they wanted to differentiate themselves from the communists. I'm not sure.
It varied by local a lot. It wasn't universal among the socialists, but it was partly a convenience politically to not be criticized and to be able to gain power. I mean, remember, you're talking about years in which the federal government and many corporations were segregated explicitly. And so especially, I mean, it's very similar to the women's suffrage movement, which went through several phases where it tried to exclude Black women, or at least make them invisible. And part of that was to appeal for the votes. You know, to get anything passed in Congress through this century, and the 20th century rather, meant you had to have votes of Southern states. And so if you were advocating for national programs, it was easy to slip into the convenience, and I put that in quotes, of racial exclusion for a greater good, which was only greater for the white people involved.
Should we talk about practical steps?
Yeah, I'm really curious about what people think might be some of the things in your society that you do. I remember for one of our July 4th programs at Riverdale when I first got there, which we did as an intergenerational sort of counter ceremony and got a lot of people there. It was actually our highest attended program of that program year, was 4th of July, when usually nobody comes to Ethical. And we really made it a reminder that the vast majority of people in what became the United States were not independent on July 4th. And we did a reading of Frederick Douglass's speech. And I read there's a children's book about Mumbit. And we had a bunch of kids there. And what really excited me was when I got to the part of the story where not only does she have the sense to get this lawsuit filed, which then causes everybody enslaved in Massachusetts to get their freedom, when she's done with it, and this is actually a historical fact, her former owner offered to pay her to keep her job. And she said no. And what happened in the room when that was said was the kids all cheered. And so, you know, for me, it was a successful teaching of the history, but also helping all the kids, whatever color, to have empathy for Mumbit and for her refusal to go back to somebody who had mistreated her. Yeah, so one of the concrete things within ethical societies is finding the books that will help your children have these values and articulate them and grow up to live by them. And I would say another concrete one, which somebody mentioned, so I'll bring it back up for them, because I think they've gone, is how do we become active on some of these issues around suppression of teaching about negative things that happened around race in the schools? When parents get to file a suit saying kids shouldn't even learn in high school that schools got desegregated, I mean, my chin has to be picked up off the ground. Jackie.
I actually thought of a children's book that I wondered if you'd give your opinion on. The book entitled Not My Idea on Racism. Have you seen that?
I don't know. I don't know that one.
Okay. I've heard some objection to it recently.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a copy of it. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I generally have an objection to limiting ourselves to just dealing with explicit racial prejudice. Bonilla Silva, through great use of statistics and all that, really demonstrates that if everybody got rid of all of their racial prejudice today, we would still have racism.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are generations of disadvantages that have built up for some and advantages that have built up for others. And the people with advantages will try to keep them and will always have a reason that is not race-based to do that. They can always find a reason that is not race-based to keep that advantage. So yeah, how do we help our children see that invisible part of racism is, to me, one of the key parts. Yeah, other concrete things. I know Brooklyn, one of the things they did, one of their members wrote a couple of plays about some of this history. One of them that was particularly intriguing was a play depicting the Children's March during the Civil Rights era. And it's a little known piece of the civil rights movement history even. I did a quick check, of people I knew who were interested in anti-racism at the time, and less than half had ever heard about the Children's March. And so they did a play that depicted a girl who wanted to go on the march and was trying to convince her parents to do it. And I think that was just a brilliant way of handling some of these issues and personalizing them so that the kids could understand. Yeah, Betty?
Yeah, I was just going to comment as one of the participants of the Children's Crusade. That both Brooklyn and the Long Island Society participated, and the New York Society. The buses and on the second march, the buses went out from the three places. And at that time, Bayard Rustin had come and spoken to the youth group of the American Ethical Union, NAO, and he said, whatever you do, for heaven's sakes, don't come down to Washington in an all-white bus. And so from Long Island, we joined with the youth NAACP in Freeport to come down. We took them seriously. I don't know what the other societies did, but it was an interesting experience because just recently I realized that one of the quotations at the Martin Luther King Memorial actually comes from his address there, or it was told by Mr. Carson, I guess. But it was quite an experience. The Park Police claimed that it was the largest demonstration they had ever seen. And I swear to you that, well, some people said it was 5,000, some people said it was 10, but the Park Police that I've interacted with said that they figured it at about 15,000. And that was the purpose of the march, was to fulfill a Philip Randolph's dream of a march on Washington. And who would have dreamed that a few years later that you'd have the Great March? But it was an interesting experience that the movement did in the New York metropolitan area. Shared, and I don't think that's well known either.
Yeah, let me guess that what Reston was trying to get at with that was that white people shouldn't use all of their funds just to get themselves to Washington, but should be helping people who weren't white also get there.
Well, also in terms of the opportunity for the experience, and because it's an ethical culture crowd, I will tell you that the major experience that I can remember was the Black minister's leadership of the youth, the NAACP, interacting with our leadership in the society, and they couldn't understand why people who didn't believe in God would engage in something like that. But as we got off the bus, they assured us all that we must be all right, even if we didn't believe in God. So of all the things that I remember that day, that was a very rich experience.
Right.
But there was also just the richness of spending a day in a completely mixed group of kids, sharing that experience. You know, we don't often have easy ways to do things like that.
Right.
We stopped at a church on the way out of town, and the parishioners had made box suppers for us. So that was a surprise. We had not known that we would have food during the day. And they gave us all this food. And the guy, the older man, was, now he's young compared to me, probably maybe 50 years old. He says he wants to thank us on behalf of his grandchildren growing up. It meant a great deal to him. And we were so grateful for the food that it was a reciprocal thing. But he said, you don't know what it's like living here in Washington, knowing there are people out there who hear our cries. Maybe we'll get statehood and then it will be over.
Carolyn has a guest there. You know, Carolyn, there's a rule in Zoom rooms that if you have a pet who comes into the camera view, you have to tell us its name.
Name is Matt the cat. Formally, it's Matthew Aloysius Parker.
Never heard that rule before.
Yeah, say hello. Okay, fine.
So another concrete idea I will throw out there, which just came up as an opportunity for us in Riverdale. A couple of the key people who have been doing eracism workshops over time, which have some of the best reputation for raising awareness from some of the people at the edge of that 55%. They have asked us to be able to use our building for a workshop, which would be for people who are poor, who can't afford the usual fees that those workshops take. Because one of the things about racism workshops is they're expensive. And so you either have to have a sponsor who pays a lot of money, or you only get people who can pay the fee. So this will be a workshop specifically directed to people who can't afford the fees, which I think is just a marvelous idea for doing it. And the facilitators are doing it for free.
And you're providing the space for free?
That's what we're intending to do. The board has to finalize approval because it's also tied up with all the, what are our conditions for meeting again after the state of emergency is lifted.
Paula has her hand up.
Paula, yeah.
Yes, hi.
Oh, so
I just wanted to, I'm
Well,
sorry, it's
Paula
not my
has her
turn.
hand up.
Paula Rochelle, go Paula.
So I just finished reading Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed.
Mhm.
And which is a journalist. He's a journalist who goes to various sites, historical sites, and it's basically, public history. How do we learn public history? Well, we have a public history site in San Jose that is not well known, and it's, maybe you've seen the iconic picture of the
Oh yeah.
of this. There's a statue to those guys in San Jose at San Jose State University, because that's where they were from. So I'm thinking a concrete thing we could do that probably would take some coordination is to coordinate with the Peace Center and other groups to have a gathering that basically ethical culture sponsors, and have a gathering, even if it's just a fun gathering. Here we are getting together. Look at this. This is, and then I know a person who knows the story of how that statue came to be, who would tell us the story. And so that occurs to me as something to take on whatever, and this is just San Jose's example, but take on whatever public history you have in your area. And certainly on the East, you got a lot more than we do on the West in terms of racism and anti-racist things and activism, and get there. When we can meet again, it's outside. We can do that.
Yeah. Yeah, activism finally got the statue to Marion Sims removed from New York Park over the last year. Marion Sims is known as the father of gynecology, and he experimented on enslaved women who supposedly volunteered. But, what does consent mean when you're enslaved? And he often did procedures on them without any anesthetics. And, his results were ones that, have benefited many women, but his methodology was horrendous. And that there was a statue in Harlem to him was especially egregious. And that has now been removed, and they're working on a replacement that's much more appropriate. Yeah, so Zabby, you want to talk?
Yes. Thank you. I of course I couldn't see, but I didn't mean to take that other turn, and I'm so glad you went ahead with the idea of getting together with having history lessons about different things. But anyway, I wanted to ask, you mentioned the racism classes, workshops, or whatever they're doing is so effective. Joan, could you have you attended one, and what is it that's so effective, most effective? I thought you might have said, or did I misunderstand?
I don't, part of it is, I think that they have well-trained leaders who run the programs, who understand the topic very deeply. And they are heavily focused on the belief side of it, but they do get into considerable part of the systemic nature of racism and how invisible it is to many people, white and black. I would recommend looking up the Eracism Foundation online.
I came across somebody who was doing that.
Yeah.
I was going to interview them, but I was wondering if you had you in other words attended yourself. You have.
I have not
firsthand
attended myself, but I have talked to many people who have been through the experience about what that was like for them.
That's interesting. They charge such high prices to attend something that is educational.
Let's reframe that as, it's not surprising that people who are doing this work at a professional level deserve to get paid decently for doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if that's where my t-shirt comes from.
And so by having people able to be paid decently for doing it, what that means is that they can continue doing it and it's not just a hobby.
Yes.
Could I ask a question, just as a quick aside to Betty Chia, asking if she's writing her autobiography, and will we have written reports of these stories that she's telling us, part of our history, please. And then to broaden it to the societies that are still here. There's a few people still here, and I can't see enough to know how diverse we are. Or how spread around the country. But I've been looking for things to read about ethical culture. I've been looking for things to tell me more about our history. I'm not going to tell you which auction site I've been to find these things to buy online because I don't want you outbidding me. But I've been finding great platforms around and going, oh wow, here's something from Algernon Black. Oh,
Right.
here's something from somebody, and I've never read so many of their materials, and I want to see these. Remember, I'm in Texas, and there's no leader. We have to make it up as we go along, and that's not always successful, as you can tell from the news. So maybe if you have history buried in the file drawers of your society, maybe you can start pulling some of that stuff out and sharing it. I'm thinking, scanners, internet, Google, it could work. And in terms of positive things, if we have a history of anti-racism and ethical culture, maybe we should dig it out and share it.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to talk about some of the times we have not been that anti-racist. And in fact, with Muzzy, had one of the primary teachers of what I would consider white supremacist propaganda in the schools. And even the books that were for the North were pretty awful when he talked about Indians as savages who deserved to get pushed west. And his assumptions that the freed enslaved people were too stupid to exercise power does not age well. But even beyond that, he also permitted even those textbooks to be cleaned up for the South. And so even the stuff that he had in that was, we might consider positive, he allowed to be erased for Southern book buyers. And so, to acknowledge some of that in our own midst too, is also, I think, to recognize that all of us have in us the potential to screw this up or be on the right path. And we're not always going to be doing the right thing. And it helps to have a friendly critique when we're not doing the right thing to get us off that path and onto the better path. on history, like with Betty Chia, one of the things that might be a good idea, I don't know how many larger societies are here, but what about if youth groups did oral history interviews with some of our elders and got some of this on tape, so that it could be dealt with over time in different ways? I know that for me, part of my learning for it has often been accidental because I was looking for other things. So for instance, when I was reading a book of letters that W.B. Du Bois wrote, I found in there correspondence with Felix Adler. I wasn't even looking for that. I didn't know I was going to find it. And here are, sociable letters about, dinner last night was wonderful, and my wife sends greetings to your wife. And, the kind of relationship they had becomes a little clearer. And the fact that Du Bois was trying to get Adler to intervene in a particular, in that case, a particular academic issue at a university, on behalf of anti-racism, that obviously Du Bois thought Adler both had interest and power in being able to do that. Yeah, Jackie?
I thought of something that some of the societies might do. I know, I don't know how many of you have been to the Lynching Museum in Montgomery.
Yeah.
Finding out, for example, if your area had lynchings, is one possibility. And then, of course, if it did, being involved with bringing those symbols to your community. Western North Carolina actually had 3 lynchings that I'm aware of, and there are people involved with trying to bring that symbol, the one that can travel, that can leave the Lynching Museum and intended to go to the communities where they happened. So yeah, that's something that popped in my mind.
Yeah, one of the things we are trying to organize in Riverdale, not just the society, but we have a racial justice book group that has involved people from other congregations. And, to give you a flavor of Riverdale, when we have the Interfaith Clergy Council, 3/4 of the people in attendance are rabbis. Inspired by a group of 4 people who have already done this, 2 people of African descent, and 2 people of, 1 person of Jewish descent and 1 person whose ancestor enslaved people. And they took a trip to the Lynching Museum and to the Holocaust Museum as a way of looking at how do we memorialize great evil that countries have done. Where is America's Resistance Museum? When I went to Scandinavia, every country there had a museum to the resistance to the Nazis. And where is our Resistance Museum? If we want to teach people to resist racism as an evil, as I would, and I'm happy to name it evil, how do we teach people more of the stories? But yeah, how about trips to the Anti-Lynching Museum as a group? And with us, it's really important that we do this with our greater community here, so that the people who attend will be from a variety of backgrounds. Because that, like Betty Chia's story of being on the bus, if we're on the bus with each other and talking about this, that itself will be a major feature. We're hoping we can work with, we have a college near us, which is a Catholic college, and which has a Holocaust center, which is headed by a Palestinian Muslim woman. A Pakistani Muslim woman. And she is very interested, if we do this, on trying to figure out how to get some college students to go with us on that trip.
There actually are two museums in Montgomery. The Legacy Museum, which is inside and very, very moving also. The Legacy Museum from Slavery to Mass Incarceration, and the Lynching Museum, which is outside.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is on the RISEC YouTube channel, which you can look for, search under RYSEC on YouTube. There's a presentation about that museum by the 4 people who went to it. And they all describe it as life-changing. I also had put earlier in the chat a new book that's out for those of you for whom reading history is really dry. There's a new book out, Kendi is one of the editors, called 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, 1619 to 2019. And it has in it, I think it's 90 essays, each from a 4-year period. And some of them are poets and some of them are historians, and they each take a snippet of that history from the beginning to 2019. And because it's different voices and separate essays, you can just read one at a time. You don't have to feel like you need to read the whole book, and you can skip around if you want. So for people who don't easily read history, which was me for half my life, it's a particularly interesting way to look at it. So for instance, for one period of history, Annette Gordon Reed writes about Sally Hemings and her relationship with Jefferson. She's, by the way, the one who, after I had written about Sally Hemings even, and thought I knew a lot about her, she wrote another book on the Hemmingses of Monticello, which I highly recommend. And it got me thinking about something I had never stopped to think about before. Why did Sally Hemings have a surname? What did that mean about Sally Hemings, that she had a surname? Because most enslaved people didn't. You know, and that's something that, you know, just went whoop over my head for years. There's a whole history behind that.
Paula's hand is up again.
Pardon?
Paula's hand is up again. Paula? No.
I'm an inveterate collector of books. Here's another one. Now, this came out of I just put it in the chat. Federal Writers Project collection of slave narratives. So if you don't know about these,
oh yeah,
absolutely. This is 21 essays of people former slaves in North Carolina, compiled by this person here. And I picked it up while on vacation in North Carolina. I don't know how available these are, but these are first-person stories that in the mid-30s, as part of the, you know, employing people, they sent people to interview these people. These are just fascinating. The originals are in the Library of Congress, but maybe there are some other compilations from other parts too. Anyway, amazing.
Yeah, lots of lost collections from that era. W.B. Du Bois at one point did this fascinating book, and I haven't been able to find a copy of the book. The Library of Congress has some of the pictures, and it was a picture book, and it just depicted Black people in America, somewhere around 1910, I think. And his intention, of course, was to counter the idea that all Black people are alike. And so he showed the incredible diversity of, how people presented themselves, how they looked, some fairly wealthy, some poor, and just to represent the incredible diverse beauty, as he said, of the race. And that's one of the lost books of that time too, of, sort of a Black pride of the era, but also meant to be a counter to that, that white myth that all Black people look alike. I now have a Black congressman, and just since January of this year, and national media has already at least 3 times put the wrong congressman's name on his picture in national news. And I don't see that the people that they mixed him up with even look anything like him. But they were Black men, so, throw this name up. Or his name attached to Mondaire Jones.
I'd like to recommend a history book that reads like a novel. It's The Warmth of Other Suns.
Oh yeah.
And it's about the migration of African Americans from the South from the early 1900s through about 1960. It's just a really fun, it's interesting. Some of it's not so fun.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting read.
Yeah. The area where I grew up in Milwaukee, we had a housing project 2 blocks from us. Speaking of socialists, Frank Zeidler, when he was socialist mayor of Milwaukee, decided that the future of housing projects should not be to put them in already poor areas, but to put housing projects that had to be integrated at the edge of development so that the white people around moved around it. So they were the ones who moved in later. And it was an interesting experiment, had a lot of negatives, which I could talk about for hours, but almost all of the African-American kids I went to school with at that time, their parents were, the phrase was up from the South within 5 years. And so many of them had stories of that great migration, and many of them were stories of that great migration. I was thinking when I was putting this together, every time I do the slide on Booker T. Washington, one of my younger brothers, my birth brother, one of his close friends in 2nd and 3rd grade was Booker T. Washington. His family was the Washington family, and they named one son George and the next one Booker T. And it sort of, to me, was a little bit of this, the different sides of American history. They also had a Martha. I went to school with Betty. They actually had 15 kids altogether, but yeah, the Washingtons were a part of our life for a while. But yeah, their parents had been sharecroppers who, after they had the 3rd child, said, we're not having our kids be sharecroppers. So they came north. And the best they could do was housing project, but all those kids did better than their parents. Betty, who was my age, became a public school teacher. Sadly, I do not know what happened to Booker. I'd love to know. Okay, well, I think it's probably time. We're tired, not getting as many more comments, but Betty and Hank, I hope that you would be amenable if somebody asked to doing some oral history interviews. And maybe help us figure out who else in the movement is still around from that era.
right, so thank you all very much for coming. Stay in touch. We'll see you, some of you on Saturday at business discussions, and next Tuesday there are, I've lost it, but I know that next Tuesday there's another program. I don't have the name of it.
Oh, I thought I had left it up, but I looked up the book and lost it.
Next Thursday is addressing the whole truth about American banking. I know that one. Oh,
Mhm.
Tuesday's Richard Carell talking about the future of ethical culture.
Right.
Yeah. Richard Carell. Sorry, I keep mispronouncing your name. I should remember that. Okay, shall I close it?
Sure.
Okay. I'm gonna turn out the lights, guys. Thanks so much.
Just 1 second.
Okay.
Could you, Joan, could you just make a book list from your talk today?
You
And
know,
maybe send it
last year I started a massive book list on racism. It's still available. Let me see if I can quickly put my hands on it.
Steve,
Just have to look for the
recording will be available within a few days on YouTube, but we also have a transcript that you can ask Anna Orkut Jans for, or just write to the AEU office and they can send you the transcript.
yeah, he's asking more broadly, I think, about books. And, you know, if I were going to start with anything, I'd start with either the 400 Souls or Kendi's massive book list. I am not finding quickly the book. Oh, here it is. This is version 3. And I update this periodically.
Oh, is it a periodic table?
Well, it's not a table.
Do you have?
Okay, there's the
this
Google
list
Doc.
does not include kids' books, and you mentioned a couple of kids' books that
Right.
are good,
Yeah,
and it might be good if you could.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a different link that is the right link. I think I gave you the wrong link first. That's the better link. The second link will work. I hope it's not an edit link.
Is The Color of Law on your list?
Yes, Color of Law is a great book.
I love that book.
There's also The Color of Money by a different author.
Yeah. The Color of Law makes it very clear how things are inherited and get worse and worse from one generation to the next.
Yeah, I was in my 60s before I realized that the mortgage that my parents got had a requirement that it could not go to anyone who lived in a neighborhood if there was even one African-American family in the neighborhood. It was a federal loan.
Yeah.
And I was in my 60s before I knew that. And I'm sure my parents never knew it because they would have refused it.
The person who first got property, who got it out of his mortgage was President, well, he was then Vice President Nixon.
Right.
And that was the first one in DC.
And the person who fought the case that discrimination, that the federal government couldn't enforce these things was a vice president of West.
Ruth Wyann Perry, and it was 1938. And when I just burst into tears when I first saw it, because he's a friend of mine. But in law school, the whole thing was put up on the screen, and there she was as the lead attorney.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have any sense of the year. I mean, she was practicing law before I was born. Friends.
Yep. So we need to record a lot of that.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, one of the things I want to do is retrieve that John Brown platform address that Felix did. I read it like 25 years ago and I want to retrieve it and see if I remember it right. But it was important enough issue to him in one of his first couple of years as a leader to speak about the ethics of John Brown and is violence ever acceptable in trying to get justice. And in true Felix Adler fashion, he spends 3/4 of it raising the questions. And only at the end does he give his answers.
Joan, I want to thank you. I'm going to leave.
Okay,
Bye.
take care and take care. I hope you got the book list.
Well, I'll get it from the transcript.
Oh, well, it won't be in the transcript.
It will be in the chat will be in the transcript, won't it?
I hope so.
We'll send it to you, Stephen.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Okay, take care.
All right. All right, we're good? Guys, I'm turning out the lights. Good night. Love you. Bye.
Right.